Good evening. I'm Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the Graduate Center here at the City University of New York, and I'm also Director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, which is the co-host for this evening's event. The Stone Center's mission is to build and share knowledge on the causes, nature, and consequences of socioeconomic inequality. I have the pleasure of both welcoming and moderating this evening's event, so welcome to those of you here in Elabash Recital Hall at the Graduate Center, and welcome to the large live stream audience as well. Tonight's event is focused on a new book published by Harvard University Press just last month, titled Visions of Inequality from the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War by Branko Milanovic. Let me first tell you a little bit about how the evening is going to unfold. Starting in just a few minutes, about 2 minutes, Branko will present highlights from the book for about 15 minutes. And he'll then join our panel, which includes Paul Krugman, Donald Robotham, and Clara Mattei for a discussion about 40 minutes in length. When the panel begins, I'll say a few words about our three esteemed panelists. So the Graduate Center, Public Programs, and the Stone Center are really pleased to have the opportunity to feature this remarkable book, Visions of Inequality. The book presents an original history of how economists, 6 in particular, thought about inequality. The book's 6 main characters, if you will, whose work span 2 centuries, have all been extensively studied. But in this book, Branko revisits them, and in what is essentially a series of imaginary dialogues, he asks each of them, what forces, in your view, determine income distribution, and how do you see income distribution and inequality evolving in the future? The book has been described as a genealogy of the discourse surrounding inequality. One early reviewer said that it was researched with forensic thoroughness, while others have described Branko's unique interpretations of these historical figures to be as unexpected as they are persuasive. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Branko Milanovic. Following a long career as an economist at the World Bank, he came to the Graduate Center almost exactly 10 years ago. He's now a research professor here at the Graduate Center and a senior scholar in the Stone Center. His earlier books, well known to many of us, include The Haves and Have-Nots and Capitalism Alone. Branko, I turn the podium over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Of course, it is a pleasure to be here, and of course, I would like to thank everybody for coming and spending this evening with us. I hope we would actually make it worthwhile, your time, and I'm sure there will be an interesting and maybe at some point even a heated discussion about some parts of the book. So this is how the book looks. Janet very kindly mentioned actually that the book centers around 6 important economists and then has actually a part which deals with the period from 1960 to 1990, and there is an epilogue. These are the people who are in the book. This is not a very original choice. You know, I start with François Quesnay, who wrote before the French Revolution. He's maybe less known, but he's by many considered the founder of political economy. Then Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, I mean, I think they don't need any introduction. Vilfredo Pareto comes next, turn of the century. And then I end with Kuznets, who wrote in 1950s and 1960s the articles and the books that I was interested in. And then, as I mentioned before, there is a chapter, the last chapter, which is fairly long, the Eclipse of the studies on income distribution, both in socialist and capitalist countries, and the reasons for that. And finally, there is a short epilogue. I have to say that to make maybe sort of things clear, although I'm not sure how well it can be seen, but look at the colors, actually. Coloring is important. When Quesnay dies, actually, this is approximately the same year, well, 1774 when he dies, so as you can see, 15 years before the French Revolution, is the same time when Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. So if you follow this gray coloring, and it's about the same time when Ricardo is born. So you see a kind of a generational change, I mean, there. The green coloring is the peak of Ricardo's work, actually, 1817. that's exactly when Marx, 1818, was born. And then likewise, if you then look at Pareto, for example, and Marx, when Marx writes the Communist Manifesto 1848, that's the same year when Pareto is born. Now, this gives you kind of a little bit the framework to think of them. It really covers 200 years. Now, nobody has met anybody physically among 6 individuals here, except for Smith and Quesnay. Now, Adam Smith met Quesnay when he traveled to France and spent 2 years there, and Smith was probably, we guess, in a somewhat how should I say, subaltern position to Quesnay, who was the head of physiocratic movement, and on top of that, Smith spoke relatively poor French, so he was unlikely to have discussed things with Quesnay, who didn't speak English. So the main idea of the book is that, first, it has no normative approach. If I was really interested in normative approach, and there are actually a couple of books that are published right now which look at the normative approach towards equality or inequality, I would have selected other people. I would have certainly selected Rousseau and John Rawls, for example. But here, of course, they are not, because I was really interested in the question that Janet already mentioned. It's basically as if I were to ask them, what forces, in your opinion, determine income distribution, and how do you think that income distribution will evolve as society advances? One of the findings, actually, if you read the book, is that essentially the perception of what is inequality changes. And to keep it very, very simplified idea, essentially you start with Quesnay, who is the first to introduce social classes in economic analysis, and he's the first to define the surplus, which is essentially the basis of our national accounting today. And for him, classes are legally defined as they were in France before the revolution. So the top class is composed of clergy, aristocracy, and government. Indeed, very much like the French composition of the 3 classes. As you know, there was the nobility, then clergy, and everybody else. Then you come to the big 3, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. Classes are now legally free, and they are legally the same, but their access to the means of production is entirely different, and they are defined as landlords who receive rent, as workers who receive wage, and capitalists, or actually Smith doesn't call them still yet capitalists, he calls them masters or employers who receive profit and interest. So now you have different idea of inequality. Then comes Pareto, for whom inequality is really inequality between the elite and everybody else. Then Kuznets, for whom inequality is inequality between manufacturing workers and farmers, or rural versus urban areas. And then come neoclassicals, for whom inequality doesn't exist. So that's basically the structure. And then, of course, I defined what I believe integrative studies of income distribution should have. It's a narrative, empirical evidence, and theory. So that's kind of easy to say, but if you look at individuals who have worked on that, not too many have produced these 3 different parts, the narrative and theory, because you have to have theory. Doesn't mean that it has to be in mathematics, but it has to have a theory, and then you have to have, I believe, empirical corroboration of what you have done. Now, let me just very briefly go over Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and say what, from that particular angle that I've taken, what are novelties, I believe, in the way that we perceive the 3 big authors. For Adam Smith, I would say that for me, the novelty was that, in my opinion, The Wealth of Nations is much more of a leftist book than The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This is not the usual view, because many people believe that since Theory of Moral Sentiments is based on essentially empathy, and The Wealth of Nations is based on the granite of self-interest, the latter one has to be pro-capitalistic. In truth, it's actually very far from being so. And the reason is that the Theory of Moral Sentiments essentially makes fun or ridicules the rich, but never questions the origin of their wealth nor their right to be on the top. That entirely changes in The Wealth of Nations, where if you read the book, you would see actually a number of points where Smith writes things that if you were to believe, well, let's see if this is going to move. Good, okay, it went to Ricardo too quickly. Where actually he questions their right to actually, or look at the way that they have acquired the wealth. So essentially he looks at plunder, stealing, cheating, monopoly, corruption, collusion, and it goes in succession. And then he says, these are, and this is the quote which I will not read in detail, you can see it, these are not people, these are normally people who influence politicians, but you should never be influenced by them or accept to be influenced because their interest runs against the public interest. So this is not the Adam Smith that you would find in the Wall Street Journal. It's actually the Adam Smith who is extremely critical of two things. What Marx later called the primitive accumulation, how did you acquire wealth? And secondly, of the political role of the rich. And I think it's extremely important to emphasize how negative was Smith about the political role of the rich. So that would be, I think, what I would take from Smith just in a very, very short, obviously, time that I have. Now, for Ricardo, I don't need to go over the Ricardian model, which I think many people know. The Ricardian model was essentially driven by his desire to see the corn laws removed, and he actually thought that if they are removed, what would happen is that the rents would go down. Landlords who should not have these rents to start with, in his opinion, should become less rich. Capitalists would gain. Workers would actually have the same real wage with corn laws or without. So notice the following thing here. If the corn laws are removed, the income distribution becomes better because the very top class loses, the middle class to some extent, at least they're in the middle, capitalists gain, and workers stay where they are. And this is what I call the Ricardian windfall, because the argument for the removal of the corn laws was increased profit for the capitalists who would then reinvest and grow the economy. So you see that in the case of Ricardo, which I think was not really noticed much, it is the case not only for higher growth, it's a case for lower income distribution. So we don't have a trade-off between growth and income distribution. Of course, Ricardo was, in some sense, a great supporter of capitalists, but his class structure, the way that he defined it, is so sharp, so clear. The class interests collide, and there is no doubt that the three classes are actually fighting against each other. In that sense, of course, Marx inherited lots of Ricardo's material and then, of course, built on that. And as Schumpeter says, I think it's let me just see, maybe I'm not, well, it was in a previous slide. Ricardo was really the only economist who may be considered to be Marx's teacher, or, that Marx really, all problems, Schumpeter says, that Marx dealt with presented themselves to him in the light of Ricardo's analysis. So for Marx, what I wanted to emphasize, and I will be very brief because Marx's chapter is very large. I'd actually spent quite a lot of time. I got lots of comments and so on. And when you deal with Marx, you deal with a more complicated thinker because you have to deal with sociology, philosophy, economics, everything else. So it becomes, of course, much more challenging. But what I would like to challenge is the sort of a view that many people have of Marx, which is based on textual evidence, but I think selective reading of textual evidence, that he had a view of income distribution that would become worse with development of capitalism and would lead to immiseration of labor, meaning the decline in real wage, and the concentration of capital in the hands of the very few people. I think that textually we can actually have four different views based on Marx's own writings how the capitalist economy would develop. And I would not go over all of them, but let me point out that there is also an optimistic scenario that you can defend, which is based on secular increase in real wage, because Marx was quite aware that real wage, or as in his terms, the value of labor power, is a historical category. In other words, it is not physiological category, but includes also historical element, and he gives you the examples of the difference in wages in England, higher obviously than in Germany, higher than in Austria, higher than in Russia. So he is quite aware of that. On top of that, as you probably know, he had this famous tendential law of the decline in the rate of profit. And if you put these two things together, you get a very different view of the evolution of income distribution under advanced capitalism. You have a very optimistic view of an increased real wage and the decline in profits. Then you can, of course, combine these two things. I will not go over all 4 scenarios, but you have a 2-by-2 situation, and you can actually have a scenario which I pointed out here. That's not in Marx, that's the interpretation of Marx, actually, is a polarized society where you can have the secular increase in real wage, but the concentration of capital. And to some extent, maybe today's US is an example of that, with the increased also share of total national output going to capital. So it's actually the decline in the labor share. And the decline in labor share, however, is something that Marx strenuously defended as the feature of capitalism. So one has to distinguish between the decline in the labor share and the decline in real wage. Now, then we come to the eclipse, and I will be very brief on that. The eclipse is essentially the question, why did income distribution studies sort of disappear? Not all of them, because there are quite a lot of empirical work. There is quite a lot of work on wages. But as I argue, these are incidental studies, and they are not integrative studies, because essentially they do not question the way that the society is structured. They don't introduce classes. They don't introduce cleavages. In the extreme case of neoclassical production and distribution functions, you basically have everybody being the same. Everybody is an agent, and people have different types of assets. You have labor, I have capital, but it's never sort of distinguished that actually one asset gives you income without work and power, and the other asset gives you income only when you work and when you're in an inferior position and have no right to make decisions. Why did it happen? I think actually in the Eastern European countries it happened because classes were technically abolished, so everybody was the employer of the state, and the hierarchical differences between the top, what so-called nomenclatura, and the rest were really not studied. Now, you look at capitalism, and the situation is not very dissimilar, because capital incomes were very seldom studied, so they were left out. Wages were discussed a lot, but capital incomes were not. And we had actually to wait until 1990s, and for even 2000s, but I remember in 1990s, Tony Atkinson wrote 2 surveys where he said, wait, but how about capital? We forgot about capital, but capital is heavily concentrated. It's actually received mostly by the rich people. It is really the key of capitalist system. In the same way that the key of the socialist system was the class structure that was based on bureaucratic power. But in both cases, this key sort of dividing line was left out of the analysis. And I argue that the reason was, as I mentioned, political reason. There are some changes in the economics per se, and then there was also the funding of research by the rich. Finally, why am I optimistic for the future? Because I think we have now a very different world where income distribution, as we all know, and that's actually, after all, why you're here tonight, has become a big topic. And we, I think, have quite a few theories on offer. We have Marx and the return of the class. We have heterogeneous agent, which is the evolution from within neoclassical approach, where actually classicists now discover there is such a thing as inequality, or reality for that matter. And then we have R greater than G, which comes from Piketty, and which is basically a story of a top versus the rest. And then you have Kuznets waves, which I actually defined in my previous book, Global Inequality, which takes Kuznets but generalizes Kuznets. And finally, 2 last really in my opinion, important developments is widening the scope to the world, global inequality studies, and going backwards in time by the use of social tables, which list social categories and groups with their average incomes and allow you, as we have recently seen, to make estimates of Mesopotamian incomes in year 900, Byzantine incomes in year 1000, and Aztec incomes before the conquest. So I'm very optimistic about the studies of income distribution, and I'm actually very happy for so many young people who are interested in them and want to work with the data and rediscover the past using income distribution studies. So thank you very much for this, and I will stop here. Thank you. I would invite everybody now to come.
Great. Thank you so much, Branko. Thank you. Glad somebody in the world is optimistic. That's really a good way to start. Okay, first of all, let me just take a moment to, I'm just going to move over slightly, take a moment to introduce this really marvelous panel before we start our conversation. So first of all, I'm really delighted to welcome to this stage for her first visit, Clara Mattei. And I just learned not only her first visit to this stage, her first visit to this building, and hopefully not your last. Clara, she's associate professor in the Department of Economics at the New School for Social Research. Her research concerns the history of capitalism, especially the relationship between economic ideas and policy making. She recently published her first book, titled The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. We are also delighted, extremely delighted, to welcome Don Robotham, who is known to many of us here at the Graduate Center, professor of anthropology here at the CUNY Graduate Center. It's nice to have somebody on stage who's not an economist to help us widen our lens. It's wide already, I know that. Don's interest encompass issues of race, ethnicity, class, alternative modernities, and immigration, with a focus on the Caribbean and West Africa. And he's published extensively on topics such as post-colonialism, transnationalism, and economic culture. Last but not least, we're joined by Paul Krugman, also known to many of us here and not here. Paul is Distinguished Professor of Economics here at the Graduate Center and a core faculty member in the Stone Center. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist, a columnist for the New York Times, and the author of many best-selling books, including most recently, Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future. So welcome to all three of these wonderful panelists. So let me just tell you what I'm going to do to give you a little bit of a highlight. This book is extremely complicated. There's a lot in it, as I'm sure you know. It covers an enormous range of ideas and empirics. So I'm going to try to keep us, without flying from topic to topic too much, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to pose a question and then give everyone a chance to reply, and then we'll keep going. I'd like to start, Don, to ask you a question. I had the opportunity to have a little bit of conversation actually with both Paul and Don, so I'm going to reflect on things I've heard them say already about the book. So Don, when we spoke about this with Branko, you mentioned immediately the lack of non-Western visions in the book. Again, something you noted to us and that Branko, of course, acknowledges. So he observes in the book that one of the omissions concerns Latin American structuralists or neo-Marxists who brought this so-called third world into economics. So my question for you, it's really a two-part question. How significant is this omission in your view? And given a chance, who would you include as the seventh character in the book, the Magnificent, as Branko put it, the seventh Magnificent? Branko mentioned Samir Amin, so I'd like you to comment on that. And if you can bear with me, I'm just going to ask a second part of the question and let you answer them together. Something else you mentioned to us at one point was the notable lack of discussion of slavery in the book and in the works of these really crucial thinkers. Branko notes in the book that racial exploitation is in fact mentioned by both Smith and Marx. Smith essentially said it was impossible to rid the world of slavery because of the power of slaveholders. Marx was openly supportive of abolition in the US, but the issues remained peripheral. So what more could be said about the presence or absence of slavery in Branko's visions of inequality?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me, and congratulations to Branko on producing yet another fascinating work. We look forward to volume 2 and perhaps even volume 3, who's to tell. On the question of non-Western views of inequality, I think this is really a very important issue. And this is why I'm so delighted to see Samir Amin, the Egyptian economist, in playing a sort of small role, but an important one towards the end. And I think the thing that strikes you, though, and I'm not sure if you'd agree, that most of the non-Western, at least as I understand them, take an ethical critique of inequality. You know, if you go back to the sort of Islamic critiques or the critiques in Buddhism, they're not, there's a materialist side to them, and income inequalities are mentioned, but they seem to speak mainly about an ethical problem which inequality creates. So from that point of view, I could understand that in a book on income distribution, this tradition is not made central. But I think it's still an important issue to go back to this tradition. A lot of the work in Islamic economics, and Sen himself mentions that heterodox Hinduism has had an effect on his concepts as well. So that is what I would say. But the key person in that tradition to me is Samir Amin. And I was really glad. I mean, even though there are problems, I grant, you know, I mean, unequal exchange, there are huge problems here, but nonetheless, I think it's extremely important, especially given the importance of global inequality, that how this is understood and analyzed by economists from the global south is really, really, really a central issue.
Could you say a little bit more about the issue of slavery from the perspective of the
well, this is
book?
The whole question of racial capitalism, really. I mean, this way of theorizing slavery is what I had at the back of my mind when I made that remark. As you know, there's a view, some of our colleagues, Ruthie Gilmore and others, who argue very strongly that a purely class analysis of capitalism doesn't work, and that one needs to analyze it as class and race and how these are interrelated and so on. So I'm not particularly satisfied with that analysis, that way of doing it, but nonetheless, this is obviously, I don't need to say that here, that the whole racial issue, the issue of difference, all of these issues really need central treatment. And this is why perhaps I'm looking forward so much to volume 2.
Branko, do you want to respond? Briefly?
Do you want to respond one by one, or?
No,
Okay.
If you might want to respond on this particular question.
Okay, I would be very brief because I think I would like to hear from
Yes.
Clara and from Paul. On the non-Western, actually, as Don said, and it is a section in my book. First, in the beginning, I say the omission is Latin American structuralists. I don't know them well enough. The second one is Samir Amin, whom actually I liked very much. And he plays an important role, even autobiographical role, because I happened to read in '75, at the same time, Alan Blinder's book, which is called Theories of Income Distributions, that has nothing in the book. And I read at the same time Samir Amin, who actually was very important by essentially claiming and arguing that the third world countries, to use the old-fashioned expression, had an income distribution which was needed for them to remain in the secondary role in the global division of labor. So what was important there is that you actually, for the first time, see the income distribution not determined from within the country, but in a global scope. So that was and actually I thought for a long time of having him as the number 7, but eventually decided against that because I must say that actually in his latter years, in my opinion, he did not develop further compared to his younger years, which were much more productive.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on. I want to ask you a question, Clara, and this relates to your own work, of course, on austerity, which I've learned about only recently and is immensely fascinating. The question is essentially, how does this book relate to your own work on austerity? In your work, you discuss austerity as a set of policies with clear distributional effects in favor of capital over labor. How does your study on austerity relate to the insights in Branko's book? And I'm going to add also just quickly part B, which comes back to Branko's comment about being optimistic about the future. In your work, you write about, which is about austerity policies in the 20s in particular, you write about them as a tool to discipline labor, arguing that the rich control the narrative. And if that's true, is Branko's optimism warranted? I guess one might argue the rich still control the narrative. Why should we expect that inequality studies will be able to flourish in the future?
Thank you. Now it's on. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here and for having given me the opportunity to read this fascinating work. So I would say that I deeply agree with Branko's method adopted in this book. And I actually see my contributions to the scholarship as being part of the narrative aspect that Branko highlights as one of the points of how to actually study income distribution, right? Not just theory, not just empirics, but also the narrative, which allows us to give importance to the dynamic element, to the explanation of how inequality emerges. And in this sense, for me, austerity needs to be really put at center stage and rethought about in class terms, seen as indeed the active intervention of the state in shifting resources away from those who make income from labor to those who make income from capital. So austerity, not just as a technical tool to manage the economy, but as a political project that ultimately increases inequality. So in this sense, I think it is very important to stress what Branko stresses throughout the book, which is how actually the political economy, the political element, the structural forces cannot be left outside of theorizing about inequality. And in this sense, the role of the state as an actor of austerity has been crucial in deciding the tendency laws of inequality under capitalism. And indeed, I very much like the idea of really stressing that Branko does a great job at, really stressing that Marx was not a determinist, and that actually he understood that capital is first of all a social relation, and as such, the subjugation of workers needs to be constantly enforced politically. And this indeed is what ultimately provides Branko says Marx has ultimately an indeterminate theory of income distribution, but I think the element of the political struggle, the contingency, is given by the role of the state in actually shaping economic inequality. So for me, this is really, really important, and I think we're seeing it as we speak. We know that United Auto Workers have won an amazing battle just in the last few days, and the question is, what will be the response ultimately of the Fed in continuing the idea of increasing interest rates? Interest rate hikes are part of the austerity toolbox. Austerity is not just cuts in spending, it's actually cuts in social spending and increases in interest rates, and also interventions in the labor market. So what will be the reaction of the Fed to the fact that there are still a lot of battles that are getting won by workers? This has an impact that is crucial to understand the tendencies of income. And if I can say one last thing, it's about how another way in which Branko's work is really deeply, deeply meaningful is in how he embeds these thinkers in the context and understands that theory ultimately is inescapably ideological to some extent, right? So the important switch from the class analysis of the classic political economists, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, to Pareto is very fascinating because it is all about the fact that Pareto was really, really frightened about socialism. And so his theory of law distribution was all meant to show that notwithstanding any social transformations, income distribution would not change. So the sense by which theory gets us to think in a passive way about reality and gives us a sense of immutability was very, very crucial to these thinkers, and Branko does a great job at underlining this.
Great, Clara, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to push us on. We want to hear from you, Paul. I'm going to switch gears to some extent and turn our attention to so-called Cold War economics, something that Branko addresses in the book, especially in the discussion of the Eclipse. So also something we've had the opportunity to discuss. So Branko argues that inequality largely vanished from mainstream economic discourse during the Cold War. And you've said that your own experience in international economics was somewhat different from what he described. So let me continue for just a moment. Assuming I've understood you correctly, Paul, you have noted that in your home field of international trade, a fundamental claim in the field was, in fact, that the income distribution effects of trade were large, swamping the efficiency effects. That doesn't seem to square with Branko's argument that Cold War economists didn't want to talk about inequality. His view, more negative than yours, is that neoclassical economists, as he noted during the 70s and 80s, for political reasons, wanted to expunge economic inequality from economics. You have argued to some extent that some blame for the Eclipse belongs on the left, and you pointed out that some key figures on the left, like Galbraith, were more concerned with rampant consumerism than with inequalities. So all that said, tell us what you think. What drove the Eclipse?
So, okay. So first, on I'm not sure this is really a contradiction to Branko to talk about international economics, except to say that if your image is that economists sort of imposed a cone of silence over the whole subject of the distribution of income, that's not right. I mean, post-Ricardian international economics has its origins in this paper by Wolfgang Stolper and Paul Samuelson, which is in 1941, which is all about how trade and tariffs affect the distribution of income. And it's in fact a deeply pessimistic. At the time, a lot of people would have said, well, yes, maybe protectionism affects the distribution of income, but surely the gains in efficiency are more important. And Stolper Samuelson says, no, actually, if you're a capital-abundant country, free trade hurts workers. And now, so there was always, certainly in my home field, it was always part of the story. Now, it wasn't part of an integrated vision of the type that Branko describes, but I'm thinking a lot about the eclipse, what Branko calls the eclipse, the disappearance of inequality from the discourse, which was even though I would say, I'm saying that in my home field that wasn't exactly true, it nonetheless was. It definitely was downplayed. Actually, I have an anecdote. My first trade book for meant to be read by normal human beings, whether or not it actually was, The Age of Diminished Expectations. It was a complicated story about the writing, but it did include a chapter on soaring inequality, because by 1989, when I wrote the book, it was already obvious that something drastic had happened. And I included a chapter about that, and the people, it was not, the editors repeatedly tried to get me to delete the chapter. They said, nobody cares about that, why is this chapter there? So this is right at the end of your period, the Eclipse. So there was a real blackballing at some level, but I'm not sure that it's as simple as saying that, well, there was a Cold War, and if you talked, I'm caricaturing Branko here, and I feel terrible about that because this is such a sophisticated book, and I'm going to do a crude caricature. But the crude caricature is that, well, there was a Cold War on, and to talk about inequality would be to sort of give ammunition to the commies. And I don't think it was that simple. I think, and Branko does acknowledge, one thing was that for most of that period, inequality was relatively, certainly by historical standards, low. We weren't as much of a middle-class society as we imagined we were, but we were much more of one than we once had been. But the other is that, it wasn't. One question is, what do we mean? Who are we talking about when we talk about economic discourse? And if we, I was there then, or at least for I was sentient for the second half of the Eclipse period. First of all, if you were to ask who were people listening to, it's not just the people that we now think of as important economists. If you had asked anybody at, in top, anybody writing economics textbooks who's the most important American economist right now, they would have been Paul Samuelson. If you had asked the well-read person on the street, if you had asked the average New York Times reader, they would surely have said John Kenneth Galbraith. It was a very, the idea that the people who mattered are the people who we now cite is probably not true as a and leftist economics was actually a much, self-consciously leftist economics was a much more prominent part of the discourse then. There were serious challenges within the field. They got squashed pretty much, but from the left. And what strikes me from memory is that the lefties didn't talk about inequality much. That there just wasn't a large focus on inequality as an important issue. And certainly Galbraith, the whole theme of the affluent society and to some extent of the new industrial state was that, people have enough. And the problem is all of this marketing and so on that induces people to want more consumption when more consumption is not the answer. So if it wasn't so much that the pro-capitalist economists were suppressing the discourse, it was that even, if anything, the people on the left were even less interested in inequality for whatever reason. And it took quite a while for people to realize that, hey, there are real disparities and sufficiency is not the norm. So I think there's a more complicated story somehow of what happened, and also cutting off at 1990. I mean, inequality started to become a pretty big, pretty fierce debate within economics after that. Even before, not just it didn't take until 2015 or something before we began to argue about it a lot.
Well, that said, I think, Branko, you sort of closed that period out in 1990, although inequality was rising rapidly 10 years before that in the US, that's for sure. Clara or Don, do you want to respond to Paul's history of the 1980s and 90s? I mean, any thoughts, counter thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I actually agree with the idea that someone like Galbraith did take attention away from inequality, even in his new industrial state, in which ultimately production is thematized. There's very little of that, and there's a sense by which, indeed, we have achieved. So that is definitely an interesting and important remark. But I do think that here the interest of Branko's chapter is to actually point to the way in which how inequality is, if inequality is largely not talked about, but when it is talked about by neoclassical economics, and thus it is the economics that ultimately trains those that then go and lead the institutions that matter for shaping society, right? In those cases, what happens is that inequality is naturalized by the very theorization of inequality, right? No one, as Branko mentioned also in the presentation, there's no interest in understanding why people have certain assets. It's just about actually deciding, it's just really about what is then our behavior once we have certain assets. That doesn't matter, it's our behavior as individuals to maximize within these models. So this excessive abstraction is very interesting. A point that you make is that it's not just about being unrealistic. So the majority of heterodox economics criticizes neoclassical economics for being unrealistic. And that has been the main, a criticism. But I think what is interesting here is that there's much more than just a realism, right? The issue here is that if you theorize a reality that doesn't actually acknowledge the heterogeneity of different actors within different classes, then what happens is that you end up hiding what should be explained, right? So this is the construction of consensus by the academia through concealing rather than explaining is much more important than just being unrealistic. This unrealism actually serves a very important political purpose. And I think in this, it is very fascinating to contextualize what were the political forces pushing for certain ideas to emerge in that ahistorical and ultimately apolitical way, but how this apoliticity was very, very political. And last thing I would like to say is that it's interesting because Branko actually makes his own self-criticism. So he says, my own work on inequality suffered somehow from uber empiricism. And this is fascinating because it's interesting because the way he uses empiricism in this book is an emancipatory, in my view, empiricism in the sense that he uses data to give us reality checks, like a very important reality checks. Even in the golden age of capitalism, post-Second World War, actually, as you write in the book, the 10% owned 90% of the assets, okay? So Galbraith was not discussing inequality as if there wasn't any, but actually, if you look at the numbers, this is when numbers help give us a sense of what was actually happening. Yet, if you do too much numbers, if you get into uber empiricism, that's when you risk losing the narrative and the theory and ultimately eternalizing the present. And that, I think, you make a really good case for.
Don, you look like you're...
Well, no, is this on?
Please, respond, please.
Yeah. No, I was thinking of the point which Paul made about a relative lack of interest in maybe income distribution among left-wing economists. And it connects to a point which Branko makes about Marx's attitude to inequality that I think is a stream in Marxism, which is that this is a subsidiary thing. It's a secondary effect. It's important, it's not unimportant, but it's not the principal thing. The principal thing is the relations of production. So if you move away from if you move to distributional issues, you really gone to the margins. And this is a very strong tradition in left-wing economics, that nothing should distract your attention from focusing on the relations of production. And I think this is perhaps a factor why there's, and Branko speaks about this actually, a very, very interesting point, which I think is part of the, so it's not so much that people are not interested in inequality, or Marx is not interested in inequality. I think, the entire tradition that Marx comes from, especially to go back to Hegel, has to do with inequality. But it is inequality in the relations of production, which is the issue here, and not so much on the distributive side.
Maybe I could just add, I think there is a sense, and I can understand this in a way, 1955 America, you had a 50% corporate tax rate that was with a lot fewer loopholes than we have now. You had a 91% top marginal tax rate, so that the actual distribution of income, the amount of money going to people just living off capital, was vastly less than it is now. But the power relations, it was a capitalist society. There was clearly there was as much difference between bosses and workers as ever. And if from a certain perspective, that's what mattered. Maybe not my perspective, but I can see that in some sense focusing on the numbers, would be taking your eye off the ball of we need to change the kind of society that we have.
Do you want to comment, Branko?
Yes, I want to comment. There are lots of things here, so I have really to be very selective. Let me say, to go back to Clara's point, which is, I think, very important, and also to make the book more accessible. The organization of the book starts with a chapter which always talks about the individual. There are 6 individuals, and puts them in their context. The context where they lived and worked. The next chapter is about inequality in their society, which we know now much better than they did. You know, Marx or Ricardo, especially in 1817, Ricardo didn't know what was the Gini coefficient for England. The Gini coefficient was invented as a measure in 1920s. So, you know, there was no, and secondly, there was much less knowledge then. But they had some intuitive knowledge or anecdotal knowledge. So when you come now to the Eclipse, very clearly Kuznets was influenced first by the first fact that the center of gravity of economic science moved from Europe, which is really always class conscious, to the United States, which is less so. Secondly, that was the time of US growth and total sort of power in the world. US produced more than 40% of the global GDP. And as Wesley Mitchell says, and I quote him in the book, in 5 or 7 years, we have traversed 1/3 of the movement from inequality to total equality, because US income distribution became more equal. So Kuznets is writing under these conditions. So I agree in that respect with Paul. However, after that, and I think that's important to read the first part of that last chapter, which deals with socialist countries. There is a clear parallelism, and I did my dissertation on income distribution in Yugoslavia. Very clear parallelism. You don't discuss top incomes in Eastern Europe. You don't discuss what I call here, and which other people have called a hierarchical coefficient, which makes basically people high in hierarchy having much higher income. And here, actually in the US, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and you don't really discuss capital incomes. So in other words, the key markers of the societal structure were kind of exempt for like being studied too much. And I think that's why actually this chapter starts with the study of income distribution in socialism, precisely to show you that kind of a parallelism and symmetry. So that was my point on this issue. Did I suppose, well, there are, of course, many other things. And actually, I would like also to mention, that's one thing that Clara mentioned, which I think is important. When you look at all these writers, there is a very clear dynamic element. In other words, they always say what they think income distribution will look in the future. Obviously, with Kuznets, it's very clear. But so is Pareto. And Pareto thinks that actually it will not change. The society, then his argument, as Clara said, I see Pareto is quite important. Pareto says, whatever, you can win the socialists. Yes, I know that you're very strong, you're more committed. Actually, he has this sentence saying, you're like the first Christians, you're actually going to win, but you're not going to change income distribution. You would have bureaucracy on top who would replace capitalists, but the income distribution would remain the same. But so there is always the dynamic element, in other words, looking at the future and how the society might look in the future in terms of income distribution.
Branko, Clara, Don, Paul, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to the audience.